The cold wind swept across the towering steel structure as trucks lined up on the European border, engines humming in uneasy rhythm. The scene looked familiar, yet something had drastically changed. This time, there were no green lights, no customs officers waving vehicles through, and no sign that the gates would open again anytime soon. Europe had made its move. A major series of border closures, bridge blockades, and transit restrictions had come into force, sending ripples across Moscow, Eastern Europe, and the entire strategic landscape of the region. In moments like these, the tension in the air felt as if history itself was preparing to shift direction. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Conflict Front Stories channel. Please subscribe and like my videos. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most dramatic geopolitical developments in recent months: the widespread shutdown of key bridges and border routes leading to and from Russia. What this means for Moscow, for Europe, and for the millions of people caught in between is a story unfolding with intensity, diplomacy, and high-stakes consequences. The story begins early in the morning when European border authorities issued their synchronized orders. Columns of armed officers took positions, road signs changed from open passage to strict restriction, and newly placed barriers locked into place. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were reinforced structures designed to halt crossings that Russia heavily relied on for transport, commerce, and access to friendly territories. The closures weren't announced days in advance. They weren't scheduled in a slow rollout. They came all at once, at the exact hour agreed upon in private meetings among European leaders. At an exterior checkpoint on the eastern edge of the European Union, camera crews captured a long chain of vehicles stretching farther than the eye could see. Drivers stepped out of their trucks, baffled, frustrated, and confused. They expected delays, but none anticipated a total shutdown. Many of the goods inside those trucks were urgently needed supplies: everyday items, industrial machinery, processed food, and a range of materials that countless communities depended on. But now they sat frozen in place. The European Union's decision to implement these closures stemmed from growing tensions, unresolved disputes, and rising security concerns. For months, officials had warned that Russia's actions in various regions were pushing Europe toward a stricter defensive posture. Diplomats tried to avert escalation. Conversations continued, sometimes for hours behind closed doors, yet they led nowhere productive. Finally, Europe decided to act in a way that Moscow could not ignore. As news of the blockades traveled, the Russian government launched its initial response, calling the restrictions unfriendly, provocative, and unnecessary. Moscow accused Europe of weaponizing infrastructure and hurting ordinary citizens on both sides of the border. But European leaders countered that the closures were targeted, strategic, and temporary measures designed not to punish civilians, but to limit what they described as the movement of destabilizing elements through European territory. Back inside an interior meeting room in Brussels, a group of EU officials reviewed real-time reports. The room, lit by a row of ceiling lamps, was filled with quiet tension as maps displayed shifting traffic data. Every few minutes, an analyst updated the team on developments at another crossing point. Despite the intense atmosphere, the discussions remained controlled and measured. The mood could best be described as serious but determined. European diplomats spoke cautiously yet firmly. They emphasized that the closures were not a step toward conflict, but a move to ensure regional safety and pressure Moscow into revisiting stalled diplomatic frameworks. They wanted international monitoring systems, stronger security guarantees, and more transparency regarding military activity near member state borders. Until then, the bridges and crossings would remain tightly controlled. The impact was immediate. Russian logistics companies scrambled to reroute shipments. Rail terminals became overloaded, and alternative corridors through non-EU countries suddenly experienced double or triple their usual traffic volume. Transport experts predicted rising costs, delays lasting weeks, and heavy disruptions to commercial systems Russia had relied on for decades. Meanwhile, everyday citizens reacted differently. Some supported Europe's strong stance, believing it was long overdue. Others feared that long-term closures might escalate already sensitive tensions. Social media became flooded with videos of halted trucks, border interviews, and expert commentary predicting difficult weeks ahead. In another part of Europe, at a border crossing near a river that had long served as a symbolic connection between East and West, the atmosphere was unusually quiet. Officers quietly patrolled near a barricade installed overnight. A journalist reporting live described the moment as a historic pause, noting that this bridge had not been closed at any major level for generations. Inside a transportation ministry office in a European capital, officials worked around the clock. They debated contingency plans, supply chain impacts, and how to maintain essential flows without compromising security. One of the officials emphasized that the aim was to create strategic pressure without humanitarian fallout. They reassured international partners that emergency supplies, medical materials, and essential goods would still be allowed through under-controlled protocols. Moscow's state media framed the situation differently. They portrayed the closures as hostile acts engineered to isolate Russia economically and politically. They questioned whether European nations were acting independently or following pressure from larger global powers. Analysts in Russia debated how long Europe could sustain the blockades without facing internal strain. They argued that border closures might hurt European markets, especially those dependent on Russian energy, minerals, or transport routes. But European experts countered by stating that the blockades targeted specific transit types, not broad trade categories. Some energy corridors remained operational, though under close monitoring. This selective strategy allowed Europe to balance economic needs while sending a strong political message. As the hours passed, the closures became the #1 topic in diplomatic circles. Countries across Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas closely monitored the developments. International organizations called for dialogue, urging both sides to de-escalate and return to structured negotiations. In a quiet interior room of a think tank in Berlin, analysts gathered to interpret satellite images showing reduced traffic across affected bridges. While some routes appeared completely empty, others showed clusters of trucks still attempting entry despite clear restrictions. These think tank experts warned that prolonged closures could push Moscow into seeking deeper partnerships with non-European states, altering global alliances in unpredictable ways. Meanwhile, European leaders held emergency press briefings throughout the day. They stood before flags, microphones, and screens filled with data charts, explaining why this moment required firm action. Their tone was resolute. They stressed unity, coordination, and the importance of protecting European borders from any form of destabilization. On the Russian side, high-level meetings also unfolded in government buildings. Officials debated how to respond. Some favored immediate counter-measures such as suspending cooperation agreements. Others argued for caution, warning that retaliatory actions could harm their own long-term interests. The atmosphere inside these strategic discussions remained intense, but decision-makers understood that every action would carry weight on the world stage. As we move deeper into this story, one thing becomes clear. The closure of these bridge routes is not just about transportation. It's about power, diplomacy, and the future of cooperation between Europe and Russia. It forces both sides to consider how far they are willing to go to defend their national priorities. By midday, drone footage captured long serpentine lines of vehicles on remote roads bordering Russia. The natural landscape stretched endlessly in full view, highlighting the isolation of these areas. A sense of uncertainty hovered over the region. People waited for updates, unsure whether the closures would last weeks or months. Inside a small border cafe on the European side, travelers gathered, each with their own concerns. A truck driver explained to reporters that he had been following this route for 15 years and had never seen such a sudden halt. A young student heading to visit relatives worried she might not make it in time. The cafe's television replayed European press conferences, and everyone watched silently, trying to derive meaning from the official language. Economists issued early assessments. They predicted rising transport costs, slower supply chains, and reshuffling of trade routes. Some industries in Russia could face temporary shortages of specialized equipment. Certain European sectors might also experience pressure, but experts noted that Europe had long been preparing contingency plans. The strategic meaning of the closures became clearer when maps surfaced showing the number of key bridges affected. These weren't random structures, they were choke points, geographic leverage points, and symbolic connectors that had shaped decades of cross-border cooperation. Inside a policy room in Warsaw, advisors reviewed security footage with careful eyes. They monitored the calm but strict enforcement of the new rules. The footage showed officers directing vehicles, explaining the situation politely, and ensuring civilian safety. The European approach emphasized order rather than confrontation. Moscow, however, viewed the action as unacceptable. Russian officials argued in interviews that Europe was undermining regional stability and turning basic infrastructure into a political tool. They warned that such actions could permanently damage relations that took decades to build. In many European cities, people debated passionately about the closures. Some believed the actions were necessary to maintain security. Others feared that the situation might escalate further. Public opinion varied, but many agreed that Europe was entering a new chapter in its geopolitical relations. Meanwhile, diplomats from neutral countries stepped in to mediate. They recommended establishing joint monitoring missions, reopening dialogue tables, and creating systems that could reduce misunderstandings at the border. Their statements emphasized the importance of communication, caution, and cooperation. Late in the evening, as border lights illuminated the empty bridges, the closure entered its symbolic phase. The stillness of the scene represented more than a halted crossing. It reflected a pause in a relationship full of complexity, history, and interdependence. By nightfall, reporters on both sides prepared their closing commentaries. They spoke about uncertainty, strategy, and the consequences of shutting down connections that once symbolized open exchange. They reminded viewers that bridges are more than concrete and steel. They are pathways that can bring nations closer or push them apart. The night sky over the river crossings shimmered with quiet tension. The world waited, both sides prepared for the next move, and Europe's decision to block key bridges had become one of the biggest geopolitical disruptions of the year. As events continue to unfold, one question remains: how long will the bridges stay closed, and what will it take to reopen them? This has been your in-depth look into the unfolding situation. Make sure you stay connected as we follow the story step by step. Thank you for watching, and once again, welcome back to the Conflict Front Stories channel. Please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more updates as this dramatic chapter continues.